Hello and welcome to my workshop. Today we're going to be getting back on the 1951 Ford F-150. The first video we got the cab and the bed, most of the structure complete. Now we're going to get onto some of the details and the paint. Alright, so let's get started. So even though a majority of the body is complete, there's still a lot to finish up. It is pretty much the same in all things, but the last finished details can take longer than you spent on the entire project. I've heard some say it has to do with slowing down because of the spent cost you have in the piece. In other words, screwing up now is a bigger deal than screwing up at the beginning. I also think it has a lot to do with the finished details are more precise and just flat out takes longer. Here I'm cutting and drilling holes for all the pieces which need to be glued on after paint. This includes the gas filler neck, hinges, and door handles. The hinges are a really neat design, which makes them look really close to the old style exposed hinges. I actually designed these for a Dodge M37, but realized they will work on the Ford too. In the past I made these from scratch, from styrene, but the 3D printing has increased the level of detail as well as speeding up the process. The best part is the stress from matching one side to the next has gone away. I tend to use a sandable filler primer for these bodies. So you can see that these molds are not 100% perfect, so a little bit of sanding is needed to smooth out the panels. The primer does a good job of filling in scratches and small imperfections. Plus it sands back to a fine powder, which is the dream for your sandpaper. At certain points during the build process, I need to stop and fill in the areas to a level that is almost ready for paint. The reason for this usually comes down to the ease of sanding. Once you add in all the details, sanding can become a nightmare. I pretty much use 3 different fillers when working on these panels. For body join lines, I will apply a medium CA glue. For larger panels, I will use Dolphin Glaze, And for small areas, I'll use a Tamiya filler. The CA glue is nice because with the accelerator, it can be sanded almost immediately. The Dolphin glaze is amazing for smoothing out panels, but does take about 20 minutes to harden up. If any more than just a light smear, the Tamiya takes about a few hours to harden up to a level where it can sand well. I try to time the Tamiya filler right before I quit for the day, if possible. The real truck has visible hardware on the inside of the bed, matching the outer fender. I replicate this with push pins that have the head cut off and glued into a small drilled hole. The front grille has a very distinctly shaped marker light, which is right below the main headlight. I found that the edge of a Tamiya headlight lens can be cut down and sanded back to a shape which is almost a perfect match. I just need to cut a matching hole in the grille. Eventually, a small 3mm LED will go behind this light to light up the marker. With the sanding and filling complete on the bed, it is time to turn my attention to those details. There are not as many as the original truck, since many of these features have been shaved, but there is still enough to make it look interesting. I have found that symmetry is crucial to maintain when working on these builds. The first thing I do is mark on the part, the center lines, and reference marks. I notice that the truck I'm replicating has a panel which hangs down lower than the reference drawing I was looking at. So I cut some strips, glued them into place below the panel where the taillight will go. These eventually will be where the taillights and license plate will be located. This is a pretty simple process, since it's just like making a box. The difficult part comes when making it look like all the corners are nice and square and even. Careful measurements help, but the most critical thing is just to look and see if it is right. You will know if it's not right. With all the substructure built up, I can turn my attention to making the tailgate. It starts with applying squares of styrene to represent the stamped steel portions. This is followed by a framework on the sides and bottom. The lowest part of the tailgate is essentially a large hinge. This is represented by gluing in a piece of styrene rod. I either add CA glue down on one side or some quarter round shapes depending on how it needs to be built up. As mentioned before, the taillights go into the lower panel below the tailgate. I use small Tamiya markers for these since the original was Frenched rectangular taillight. There's no need to make a housing, I just need to drill a hole, file out the hole until the lens snugly fits. I can then add a LED light tape behind the hole and the light should light up really nicely. I was pretty much done with all the major parts of the body at this point, so I needed to move over to the chassis. I had a few ideas about what to use, but ended up with an SCX10 chassis rail, RC four-wheel drive rear axle, semi-truck solid axle for the front, and a planetary gearbox. Many would know that the drive angles for the leaf-sprung trucks are tricky and that it's amplified when you're doing custom mounts. I can't remember where I saw this first, but I decided to make wedges for the axle. I've done this in the past with a file and a piece of aluminum. This time I 3D printed the pieces. The idea is to flip the axle over and the bracket slips around the axle while allowing two screws to pass through, clamping down the axle. This gives you two things, one being the ability to adjust the height based on the thickness of the bracket, and the second is the ability to adjust the angle. For the angle brackets, a matching wedge needs to be installed on the top of the leaf so the screw has a flat spot to clamp down on. Of course, before I can do any of that, I needed to lengthen the chassis rail. I looked at a few ways to do this, but the easiest was to add a section in the middle. Thanks to Scale Metal Supplies for sending me this axial chassis rail cutoffs. I wish I could buy this stuff by the foot, but it just doesn't exist. In general, the hardest part of brazing pieces together is holding it in place. I took some tapped metal pieces and bridged the rail section before soldering. This adds needed strength and, as mentioned, keeps things in proper alignment. Once this is soldered, I can simply grind the screw head off and it really isn't noticeable anymore. The width didn't match any of the skids I had in my stash, so I just cut my own from a thick sheet of Delrin. The stuff works great since this is easy to cut, sands, and takes a tapped hole very well. The rear tires took a little creativity and my 3D printer to get them to work. I really like the look of the wheels, but the rear ones are a lot wider than the front. I'm using these semi-truck tires, so there isn't a lot of flexibility in the tire there. I also wanted to maintain the shape, so a spacer was designed and printed to widen the wheel. Once installed, the width is spot on, and the spacer is hidden inside the wheel and cannot really be seen. Some of the last details to sort out are the wipers, which were also 3D printed and just need a small hole to install. In order to tie the cab into the bed, a vacuum mold for the running boards was created. It's a pretty simple design with just two boards glued at a right angle. I had a little bit of shaping before adding on some filler. I got the idea from watching Turks and Jerps, where he made a custom shape to form the filler. So, a piece of styrene was cut and sanded down so I could create the radius between the two boards. Just a little bit of sanding and you have a finished piece. The last part was to add in some half-round styrene to represent the bumped up area on the running board. These bumps not only look good, but add a lot of strength to the final piece. It's hard to tell what the final piece will look like. In this case, I wish I had used a little smaller half-round shapes. The end result is fine, but it would have been a little bit better if the shapes had a little more space between them. A structure was required to mount the running boards. I am moving more and more towards mechanical connection for these large panels. I like the ability to take them apart and paint or repair the item. It just means that I need to work a little harder making the substructure. The piece which came out of the mold didn't need much, but did require a little extra thickness in places to make sure it would bolt up securely. The original truck has one giant louver on each side. In the past, I have made a mold which can be used to form aluminum panels. For this one, I decided that a 3D printed part would work best. I just cut a slit and glued in the piece from behind. A little filler, light sanding is all that's required to make it look molded into place. Like most older vehicles, there is a rain gutter which runs over the doors. It's best to build this with a piece of styrene quarter round. When I cold bend styrene, it causes like micro stress points, which solvent has a tendency to find and break. The best thing is to use CA glue and tack it down. The part is so small and tucked so closely to the body, there's generally no issue with it. I do the same thing for the windows, but use half round instead. This overlaps the window opening, giving a place to hide the cut edge of the window when placed in later. The back has a solid mount with Velcro to the underside of the bed. For the front, I wanted something quick and easy to remove, but also sturdy. A small piece of Delrin plastic was chosen to bridge the chassis rails out in front of the servo. Before I attempted the front body mount, I wanted to get the planetary gearbox in its final spot. This is a 1:5 gearbox, which will later be replaced with a 1:3. The 1:3 is a little bit faster, which gives the truck the needed extra wheel speed. The gearbox has a flange which has two tabs that extend away from it. This allows two pieces of Delrin to be bolted to the chassis, and the flange to be mounted to the Delrin pieces. A piece of aluminum was cut that bolts to the lower lip of the front grille surround. I positioned the screw so that they would be hidden by the grille once it was screwed into place. This piece of aluminum matches in width and angle to the Delrin piece bolted to the front of the chassis. An M4 screw has a hole drilled through it and mounted to the Delrin piece. Once this sticks through the aluminum piece, a body clip can be used to securely mount the front of the body to the chassis. Now that the chassis and drivetrain is finalized, I need to attempt to mount the shocks. The rear has some short semi-truck shocks mounted up to an RC4-wheel drive shock hoop. Luckily with the super wide wheel fenders, the hoop clears the body no problem. The front gets Vetera shock hoops and a little bit longer shock. There's still a bit more to go before this truck is roadworthy. However, it is coming along really nicely. As mentioned, there's a lot more to do on this truck, and many more fun projects on the horizon. Until then, I'll see you in the rocks.